Good afternoon, everybody. It's Phil Riley, a longtime friend of Michael's. Going to give a very short introduction to Michael. Mike worked for the Canadian federal government for 34 years, from 1969 until 2004. For a few of those years in the 1970s, he was a Canadian Wildlife Service researcher focused on chemical contaminants affecting avian species. Mike and I had our open floor workstations in the Wildlife Service across from one another, and we were able to sort of entertain, go for coffee and things like that. So it was a very personal experience that I had with Mike back then. During the last 16 years of his career, he worked at the Great Lakes Regional Office of the International Joint Commission in Windsor, Ontario. And for the past 20 years in retirement, he has been trying to make sense of the experience, firstly through completing a doctorate, and more recently by integrating evidence from different scales and through different frameworks. So Michael, I'm passing the floor over to you, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Phil. Good afternoon, and thank you, Phil Riley, for inviting me to give this presentation. As Phil said, I worked in various different organizations in the federal government on water, wildlife, in the Environmental Protection Service, in fisheries, briefly back in the Environmental Protection Service again before I went to the International Joint Commission. And then I went on to do my doctoral studies in University of Stirling in Scotland. Now, Phil asked me more than 6 months ago to give a talk to the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome. And putting the talk together reminded me of the time in 1972 when I was a newly minted bureaucrat with the Canadian Wildlife Service, when the Limits to Growth was published. And the association's DNA, presumably, is wrapped up in the model that Jay Forrester and Donella Meadows and colleagues published, using a systems approach and modeling the likely scenarios of unlimited growth. The models predicted sometime in the middle of the 21st century, there would be a catastrophic decline in food and in output per capita, and a subsequent collapse in population. In 2014, Graham Turner retrieved data on the parameters and showed that the world economic situation approximated those predicted in the original model. And in 2021, Guy Harrington of the accounting firm KPMG used updated data and showed empirically that, as predicted in the 1972 Limits to Growth study, growth would likely slow down by 2030 and societal collapse could occur by 2040. This is the context for my talk this morning. In 1971, I had found evidence that fish-eating birds in Great Lakes colonies had an anomalous incidence of deformities, including chicks with crossed bills, missing eyes, duplicated feet, gastroschisis, and growth retardation. These included observations in gulls, colonies of gulls, terns, and what few cormorants were left. And this was a sentinel event, and I took it to mean that there were teratogenic chemicals in the Great Lakes environment. And this was a novel finding and posed the larger question, what were the implications of environmental teratogens for humans? In the 1970s, both the Canadian and United States federal governments developed new legislation to respond to the reports of actual effects of environmental chemicals on fish and wildlife and of suspected effects on human health. Canada developed the Environmental Contaminants Act, and by 1980 had regulated PCBs, polychlorinated terphenyls, polybrominated biphenyls, Mirex, and chlorofluorocarbons. The United States passed the Toxic Substances Control Act that specifically addressed PCBs, Meanwhile, the industry fiercely attacked proposed TSCA regulations through the courts and stymied any progress on regulation of existing chemicals. It is now 50 years since these initiatives, and perhaps it is time for a retrospective effectiveness evaluation. This presentation is a forensic audit to determine whether the two governments were successful in protecting human health from the actual exposures and effects of chemicals. In 1987, I met Dr. Theo Colborne, who was trained as a pharmacist and toxicologist and was an avid birdwatcher. She was involved in a collaboration with the International Joint Commission, which was investigating the effects of toxic chemical pollution under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. In her laptop computer, Theo had collected the literature on effects of toxic chemicals on fish, wildlife, and humans. As a pharmacist and toxicologist, she was interested in the molecular mechanisms of developmental processes and how chemicals might interfere with them to produce abnormalities. By 1988, Theo had formulated what she called her hormone hypothesis, and the hypothesis was partly based on the analogous pharmaceutical model of the estrogenic compound diethylstilbestrol, which had been shown by Dr. Arthur Herbst to be a teratogen, causing a rare vaginal carcinoma in the daughters of mothers who had taken diethylstilbestrol during pregnancy. In 1991, Theo organized a wing spread conference and invited 20 scientists who were undertaking research on the developmental effects of chemicals on fish, wildlife, and humans to discover for themselves what she believed was occurring. And the participants realized the commonality between their work and excitedly formulated a consensus statement on endocrine disrupting chemicals. And in 1996, Theo and colleagues published a popular international version of their research called Our Stolen Future. And the book was enormously influential in persuading the US Congress to enact legislation to set up an endocrine disruptor screening and testing advisory committee. Theo's hypothesis remains a significant challenge to traditional toxicology, which, based on Paracelsus, assumes that the dose makes the poison. Toxicology testing is undertaken at several high doses below a maximum tolerable dose to determine a dose with no observed adverse effects. And the risk assessors apply a series of, quote, safety factors to set a regulatory level, and they assume that doses below that regulatory level are safe. Ominously, there is no testing at these safe doses to see whether any effects are occurring. Hormones operate in the body at exquisitely low and precise concentrations. And in contrast to the toxicologists, the endocrinologists, such as Dr. Fred Bomsal, start with doses that are perhaps 1 million times lower than the regulatory level. And many of these low-dose endocrine signals are based on interaction with specific receptors. Some modern chemicals can mimic this receptor-based signaling, and the response is dependent on affinity between the chemical and the receptor. Testing for effects includes doses that are within the range of human exposures, making the data directly relevant for human protection. Advances in mechanistic data through genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, and metabolomics further supports the hypothesis of low-dose effects at environmentally realistic concentrations. Epidemiological studies have linked low-dose exposures to endocrine-disrupting chemicals to actual human diseases and disabilities, challenging the idea that regulatory authorities have protected human health. One of the more bizarre aspects of the endocrine disruptor hypothesis is that the curves derived from testing show a non-linear relationship between dose and effect, known as non-monotonic dose-response curves. The slope of the curve changes sign within the examined dose range, and hundreds of examples are now available from studies of cell cultures and whole animals and from epidemiology. Regulatory officials using established risk assessment methodologies dismiss these non-monotonic dose-response curves as non-significant. The implications are that low-dose effects cannot be predicted based on high-dose observations. Low-dose effects thus invalidates the assumptions of the risk assessors for making all their regulatory decisions using traditional toxicology based on the 15th century tenets of Paracelsus. Theo Colburn set up an organization called TEDx, the Endocrine Disruptor Exchange, to receive funds to move the science forward. This is an interactive layered chart from her website that documents not only the normal timing of developmental processes throughout the body, but also layered beneath the critical periods when specific substances derail these processes. This was a significant triumph of integrative science. There has been extensive skepticism about the tenets of the endocrine disruptor hypothesis from both within governments and in industry. Quite independently from the study of chemicals, there is support from another hypothesis formulated by Dr. David Barker. He had studied a cohort of Dutch infants who had been in utero during 1944, when the Nazis had stolen most of the food from Holland and the Dutch population was literally starving. These children had low birth weights from a lack of prenatal nutrition and tended to experience coronary heart disease in adulthood. He posited, quote, a thrifty phenotype, which resulted from prenatal starvation that produced an individual with a tendency towards overweight and obesity. And with this model and with knowledge of the epigenetic changes that can occur during fetal life, Theo had a model of how prenatal and perinatal exposures to environmental chemicals might misalign developmental processes and influence the growth, development, and health of an individual in adulthood. Of even greater concern is the observation that these changes can be passed on to future generations through epigenetic changes. Factors that could cause epigenetic changes include undernutrition, stress, infection, and other harmful exposures, determining the risk of disease later in life. In 2012, the conflict between the endocrinologists and the traditional toxicologists was joined through a $30 million experiment. The consortium linking academic and regulatory insights on BPA toxicity, codenamed Clarity BPA, used the estrogenic compound bisphenol A as the active ingredient. The main contestants were, in one corner, the Food and Drug Administration and the National Toxicology Program, who undertook the core study in their own laboratories using the traditional toxicology approach and following established toxicology guidelines. In the other corner were 14, quote, academic investigators funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. The two key questions were, would the academic investigator studies show effects at low doses of bisphenol A, while the core guideline study conducted by the Food and Drug Administration only showed toxic effects at high doses? And would the academic investigators be able to replicate their numerous prior studies with animals raised and treated in the FDA's Toxicology Center? Professor Fred von Saal, who has studied bisphenol A extensively as an estrogenic compound, has critiqued the process on several grounds. First, he objected that the rat model that was to be used by the FDA was known to be insensitive to estrogen and estrogenic compounds. Secondly, the rats were mainly dosed to BPA by stomach gavage, and the stress may have influenced the outcomes. Thirdly, there was no negative control group that was not gavaged. And fourthly, the chemical analyses of BPA contamination in the animals was incomplete. And Fred noted that before the FDA released the data to the academic researchers, the FDA unilaterally published a press release stating that BPA was safe, thereby undermining any sense of their own objectivity and displaying their predetermined biases. Nevertheless, the academic researchers still found the expected effects at low doses of BPA, even in the FDA estrogen-insensitive rats. The implication of the failure of the health authorities to detect, acknowledge, and respond to information about endocrine disruptive chemicals infers that populations around the world have been exposed to chemicals that interfere with normal developmental processes. What evidence of disease endpoints do we have of this potential disaster, and how long might this have been going on? The Endocrine Society has reviewed the evidence in 2009 and again in 2015 and provides us with a potential list of disease endpoints, including male and female reproduction, breast development, prostate cancer, neuroendocrinology and neurodevelopment, thyroid function, metabolism and obesity, cardiovascular health, diabetes, and hormone-sensitive cancers, such as breast cancer. My methodology for this talk has been to search for, quote, pictures, images, temporal trends, incidents, and then to add the selected endpoints. And the following examples are a few of the results of these searches. Professor Niels Skakebæk at the Copenhagen Hospital has detailed a testicular dysgenesis syndrome. The first indication of a chemically induced disorder was documentation of a 1% annual global decline in sperm counts, published with Elizabeth Carlson and colleagues in 1992. Other aspects of the syndrome include cryptorchidism, hyperspadias, anomalies of sexual differentiation, and testicular and prostate cancer. These findings pose the difficult but important societal question whether the incidence of gender dysphoria and other aspects of gender misalignment may have increased during recent decades. There seems, however, to be no empirical data on this possibility. As with the Barker hypothesis, metabolism is an important set point for infant development. The Center for Disease Control has documented the incidence of obesity in children since the 1960s, and the rates have significantly increased for children of all age groups, 0 to 5, 6 to 11, and 12 to 19 years old. indicating a population-wide change in children metabolism. Similarly, the Barker hypothesis predicts that prenatal exposures to obesogenic chemicals would result in an overweight and obese phenotype. Thus, of particular concern is the increase in the incidence of overweight and obese adults throughout the United States population. Only a quarter of US adults have a normal body mass index, posing serious issues for recruitment into the US military. The crossover point between obesity and overweight occurred about 2015, and now about 43% of adult males are obese and a further 32% are overweight. And of particular concern is that there is no consensus on the cause. At this point, there are three competing hypotheses of causation. First, industry says that overeating and lack of exercise is to blame. Second, the governments point to overeating, lack of exercise, and exposures to obesogenic chemicals. And finally, Dr. Paula Bailey-Hamilton indicated in 2002 that increasing production of obesogenic chemicals alone are responsible. And without a firm consensus on the cause, no effective plan of action can be devised. I would take a counterfactual approach and, along with Dr. Paula Bailey-Hamilton, posit that if there had been no exposures to obesogenic chemicals, then there would have been no epidemic of overweight and obesity. Lack of exercise and overeating may have caused a few individuals to put on weight, but they do not cause the obesity epidemic. Of course, counterfactuals are not much good without a mechanism or two. And with set point theory, Jerry Heindel has proposed a teeter-totter balance of satiety and hunger. The stomach produces ghrelins to tell the brain that it is hungry, and the adipocytes release leptins to tell the brain that it is satiated. Both of these systems are susceptible to endocrine disrupting chemicals, tending to increase the hunger signals and decrease the satiety signal. Further, endocrine disruptors interfere with the peroxisome proliferator activated receptor system and tell the adipocytes to replicate. More adipocytes, more fatness, more overweight, more obesity. These striking graphs from Autism Speaks show the disturbing temporal increase in the prevalence of autism since 1975, when the prevalence rate was about 1 in 5,000. In 2014, it was reckoned to be 1 in 68, and by 2020, it was 1 in 54. The figures acknowledge that some unknown portion of the prevalence may be a result of changes in the diagnostic criteria and methods, but notes that the increase seems to be real. The late Dr. Helen Daly was a professor of psychology at the State University of New York in Oswego, who specialized in the psychology of frustration. Her research was based on the prior epidemiological work by other psychologists, Drs. Joseph and Sandra Jacobson of Wayne State University, who had shown behavioral changes in newborn infants of mothers who had eaten coho salmon from Lake Michigan. Helen fed Lake Ontario fish to rats and found they became hyperreactive to negative events. The rats were fine as long as life was all right, but became much more frustrated than rats fed ocean fish or rat chow when given a small reward when expecting a large one. Helen then found the same effects occurring in rat offspring, only exposed in utero. Helen then set up an epidemiological team at SUNY Oswego that replicated the Jacobson's work, investigating the behavioral effects in infants born to women who had eaten Lake Ontario coho salmon when pregnant. The offspring were more reactive to frustrating events, depending on the amounts of fish their mothers had eaten during pregnancy. Lake Ontario and Lake Michigan coho salmon notoriously have high levels of organic chlorine contaminants, and particularly PCBs, that have been shown to alter brain development and functioning. What are the implications of these neurodevelopmental studies, particularly in the Meadows scenario world of 2024 that is becoming more competitive, crowded, and armed with sophisticated weapons? Exposures to endocrine disrupting chemicals can alter the development and functioning of the immune systems. Type 1 and type 2 diabetes or autoimmune diseases, and the Center for Disease Control has documented the increased incidence in children under 20 years old in the United States during this century. Another indication that autoimmune systems have been disturbed is Canadian evidence of inflammatory bowel disease, which has recently been increasing at a rate of over 7% in children under 5 years old. While searching for these examples of changes in the incidence of autoimmune diseases, I came across this interesting paper that noted increases in Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, as well as type 1 diabetes and asthma. The hygiene hypothesis had been put forward to explain these increases, suggesting that the declines in exposures to microbiological diseases and has increased a public cleanliness might be causal factors. 10 years later, this increase in autoimmune diseases was revisited, and the following hypotheses were suggested: gastrointestinal antigens, dietary peptides, bacterial composition, hygiene, parasites, and leaky gut syndrome. The possibility that exposures to environmental chemical pollutants might be the cause was never mentioned. And this poses the uncomfortable question whether the omission of chemical exposures from the list of hypotheses was a lack of imagination, or whether postulating effects of chemical pollutants might somehow be discouraged. This also poses the central question in all this forensic epidemiological research: how do medical doctors and scientists prove causal relations? And this question was famously answered in 1965 by Sir Austin Bradford Hill in his presidential address to the inaugural meeting of the section of occupational medicine at the Royal Society of Medicine. The annual costs in the United States of exposures to endocrine disrupting chemicals exceed $340 billion, calculated as both healthcare costs and lost earnings. And this is equivalent to more than 2.3% of the US gross domestic product. Similarly, in the European Union, the annual costs are 157 billion euros, which is the equivalent of $209 billion, again calculated in healthcare expenses and lost earning potential. From these examples, I would contend that we not only have multiple disease endpoints implicating epidemics of chemically induced diseases, but also have multiple crises in establishing forensic causation. First, among clinicians and medical researchers, there seems to be a cone of silence concerning hypotheses involving endocrine disruptors. Secondly, it is extremely rare to find that the viewpoints of Sir Austin Bradford Hill have been applied to establish a causal relationship, even though they are recognized both in medical science and in the legal system as the framework for inferring causation. Though epistemology is a well-established area of philosophy, the medical research profession seems to eschew the use of philosophers in their investigations. The recent developments in toxicogenomics, linking the relationships between chemicals, genes, phenotypes, and diseases, might offer powerful new ways of integrating data, particularly using bioinformatics. And finally, the forensic investigation of causation will continue to be frustrated by the public relations agnotologists who are intent on manufacturing uncertainty on behalf of corporate interests to protect profitable, though injurious, products. I tend to have addressed the scientific and technical aspects of endocrine disrupting chemicals, but there is a need for consideration of the social, economic, and political contexts, particularly as we face the limits to growth, with all that that entails during the next decade or two and into the distant future. There is a need for a critical analysis, such as Professor Harry Glassbeck has provided in his book, Wealth by Stealth, particularly on understanding the implications during the past 40 years of the implementation of a neoliberal ideology characterized by small government and market economics. While medical and environmental researchers and their institutions are too frequently cognitive of not biting the corporate and government hands that fund them, it is important to remember that the injuries that are occurring are not potential, but represent actual effects with massive associated liabilities. Environmental medicine thus needs to stop operating in its cone of silence. It would seem that we have arrived temporarily at the predicted limits to growth. And this brief forensic analysis indicates lifelong exposures of populations to anthropogenic chemicals. And some of these are developmental teratogens called endocrine disruptors. There have been multiple epidemics of chemically induced developmental diseases, deformities, disorders, divergences, deficits, disabilities, and death that have been unacknowledged by public health authorities and denied by industry. During the past 80 years, health and public health authorities at all levels of government have failed to protect populations from exposures and from the effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals. And similarly, the environmental regulatory authorities have failed to protect populations using existing legislation. The injurious results of this abrogation of responsibilities represent massive social and economic costs and untold misery for households and society at large. Though the authorities in our neoliberal world would prefer to blame the individual for these failures, the causes are structural and reflect the economic and political ideologies of our times. Finally, scientists, including medical doctors, have been reluctant to use the available tools to start to address endocrine disrupting chemicals as the causal factors responsible for these developmental pandemics. I want to thank you for this opportunity to tell you about my concerns about endocrine disrupting chemicals and to put it in the context of the limits of growth. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, well, thank you very much. We have had a couple of people indicate that they want to ask questions. So Richard van der Jag and Meg Sears are the two that I have on tap. So that's going to leave lots of room for other people to formulate their questions and ask embarrassing questions of those people that you have criticized. So anyway, go ahead, Richard. You're number one. Meg will be
Thanks.
coming up.
Thanks, Michael. That was a great talk. I liked it, and it speaks to my heart. Been, as you know, I've been working on this area for a long time, but I'm just wondering how you can explain the non-monotonic effects that you showed at the beginning. What is the mechanism for that, for non-monotonic effects?
Well,
And then the second question is, if you could maybe explain to the group what happened when SEPA was being revised by the Senate last year. I mean, that might be worth indicating what happened.
well, let me try and address the non-monotonic dose responses. As I understand it, these chemicals can mimic the ways in which true natural hormones, actually interact with the receptors. They will then trigger a signal, which will then bring a cascade of signals to the cells. The cells themselves have feedback mechanisms to turn those signals off if things seem to be going wrong. And that's my understanding of what this non-monotonic dose response is. You get this terrific effect occurring at these enormously small concentrations of chemicals, of the chemicals which are mimicking these natural hormones. But the cells themselves have these natural feedback mechanisms which are able to turn them off, to turn the response off. Now, I don't know an awful lot about the SEPA process. I was actually with the Environmental Protection Service in the 1970s when we were developing the original Environmental Contaminants Act. And everything was going really quite well. And we got a whole series of chemicals that were controlled. And then I think industry at that point sort of realized what was going on. It was a relatively simple act, less than 20 pages long, which was trying to address the kinds of effects that we were finding in the environment and trying to protect fish, wildlife, and human health from these kinds of chemicals. Over the years, the unfortunate thing was that it then got amalgamated into one large act, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. That was in the 1980s. And I think my other concern is that instead of understanding that this act, the original act, was judged to be constitutional under the criminal law power, this gave the Canadian federal government the right and the responsibility to address those chemicals that were so dangerous that they would be a danger to health and the environment. My feeling is that by turning over to become a chemicals management program, they have lost the focus of criminality. They've lost the focus on prohibition and proscribing all activities involving certain chemicals. The other really retrograde part was that in each of the original clauses, there was chemicals and classes of chemicals. And what we have lost is it hasn't really been lost. It's there in one clause only rather than in every clause. We've lost that focus on chemicals and classes of chemicals and being able to ban whole classes. For example, compounds like the phthalic acid esters, the bisphenol A family of chemicals. All of these are quite inappropriate and have caused very substantial injury to human populations.
Yeah, I think, sorry, were you finished?
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
I was going to say, my understanding is that when they revised SEPA, basically the industry had so much influence, pesticides, fungicides got a free pass. And they didn't revise that at all. And then actually this year, somebody who was on the Pesticide Management Review Agency, doctor we know well, Dr. Lampier, you know him, or maybe you know him, but he just left the PMRA and so frustrated because industry has so much influence over the PMRA that he didn't feel that it was doing its job.
Meg's got a point.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. That's you managed to pull that together so beautifully. It's I should just clarify one thing from what Richard was saying is that pesticides are actually not under SEPA, they're under the Pest Control Products Act. But it is kind of ruled by the same kinds of systematic problems with chemical assessments and so on. I had one very specific question, but I'll kind of I'll sort of introduce it with a more general question. Just has to do with following on from the classes of chemicals and the level of evidence that is needed, which is related to that criminality thing. I think that turning this into a criminal, or well, that's kind of the head of power for the.
That's right.
But that focus on criminality means that what we see consistently from the federal government, you know, when we say you should be banning this pesticide, you know, children are getting leukemia, whatever, they say we have not got consistent and convincing evidence of this particular effect. And so therefore, you know, we can't take any action. And we've got industry manufacturing contrary information and, you know, kind of blowing in the wind on that. So that was that kind of evidentiary hurdle and clarity is you do so beautifully, but that's the wall that we continually run up against. Is it has to be consistent and convincing, and when we've got bot science, it's never going to be that. So we're kind of stuck in this morass of toxicity generally.
This whole area, I mean, the word agnotology is probably new to most of the people on this call. I hadn't come across it for a long time. But of course, it goes back to the tobacco science, the tobacco years back into the 1950s. And both Robert Proctor, who was the one who actually manufactured the term agnotology, and Naomi Oreskes, who has published a book called Manufacturing Uncertainty, something like that. They have done an extraordinarily good job of laying out the evidence and the techniques that are used in this whole area of trying to manufacture uncertainty. If you can manufacture uncertainty, the bureaucrats really don't want to take any decisions. They're very, very cautious. and the politicians don't want to be exposed to any kinds of uncertainty at all. They don't want to make decisions that might go the wrong way. And so really the industry has been extraordinarily successful, extraordinarily powerful, with enormous resources to maintain their profits by keeping these injurious chemicals on the market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And arguably the politicians, they don't have the expertise. They don't have the background to be able to, go through this kind of information. And they just kind of shrug and say, oh, I'm dependent upon the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is, Anyway, I did have one very specific question. That's fascinating results about the women who ate the salmon and then the neurodevelopment of the children, of their offspring. And I was just, and organochlorines are incredibly important as endocrine disruptors. The other major toxicant that can contribute to that would be mercury. And particularly back in the day, there was so much mercury contamination, which continues to this day, from the chloralkali plants that were used for bleaching of pulp and so on. So is there research where they looked at both of those together?
I'm not sure that they did it in either the Gilbertson study or in Helen Daly's study. I'm not sure that they were looking at mercury. I think mercury has a whole series of endpoints, particularly things like cerebral palsy, but also other developmental endpoints. I'm actually not sure as to how they distinguished between effects that might have been as a result of exposure to the PCBs versus the mercury. I'm pretty sure that that was addressed in the design of the original studies. And I'm pretty sure that it was the levels of PCBs which are in the coho salmon, which were the real flag, and the levels of mercury which were out in the open lake itself, which were a lot lower. And that probably determined how they were going to go about doing the experiments.
Oh, because people quite normally do measure mercury in fish, and it's and anyway, it's and this is where doubt can come in too, because then somebody says, oh, well, these people were eating fish, and those chloralkali plants, they use that chlorine from those chloralkali plants to bleach the pulp, and you get the PCBs. So, you get the mercury and the PCBs from that era of pulp bleaching as kind of a package. So but that's really, really important. But thank you so much for this great work. I'm sure that lots of other people are all lined up to ask you good questions.
Thank you.
Okay, so Dave, you are up, and Tim Lash, if you would turn on your video and get ready for the question after Dave's. And no, I don't have any other questioners after Tim.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you very much, Michael. It certainly brought back to mind a lot of stuff that I was doing when I was in the government of Canada. For a very long time, I tried to raise concerns about epigenetic disruption of metabolism and obesogens. I was actually involved in one little bit of support to Environment Canada regarding the use and storage of PCBs related to electrical equipment in schools. And we did work with that Gilbertson study. I don't recall anything about mercury in that study, but I can try to relocate the thing, see if I can find anything further on that. My question, well, my comment is, I think I was quite unsuccessful in generating shared understanding. That was several decades ago, over a course of about 20 years. And I was wondering if you think that things have changed.
I'm not close enough to Ottawa, and I'm not close enough to the government itself. I don't see anything has changed. If anything, I would have thought the industry is much more deeply entrenched now, and is much more influential with the bureaucracy. It's just this extraordinary impotence that we have on the outside. We have this, it doesn't matter whether it's on the inside or the outside, if you're with government or if you're outside of government. I put it down to this extraordinary ideology which came in really in the 1980s with Maggie Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and with Brian Mulroney. This idea, the ideology of neoliberalism, and that really market forces should be front and center of decision making. We should go through a whole deregulation process. Government is the problem. It was that whole ethos from that time which really took environment and took environmental contaminants off the political agenda. And it has never been allowed to come back onto the political agenda. My own feeling is it's only through looking at this kind of injury which has happened over all this length of time, actually showing, using these forensic techniques, that this has actually occurred and that populations have been very seriously affected. It's only through that and through a social movement which is associated with that that we can start getting the kind of pressure back onto the government to understand the enormity of the mistake that they have made. I think the other important point is that neoliberalism was never intended to be applied to the environment. It was intended only to be applied to the economy and finances, the deregulation process. It was Ronald Reagan who extended it from the economic area and decided that deregulation had to be imposed on the environment as well, that the trouble really started. And Canada went down that path as well.
Interesting. Two quick observations that I think are directly related. The first one is that you had mentioned that the bureaucracy tends to be risk averse, but I would argue that the bureaucracy tends to be risk ignorant. They are aware of some risks, as in, well, we'll get pressure from industry, but they're not aware of other risks, such as we're going to kill thousands of people. If they were truly risk averse, they would never make many of the kinds of decisions which they do make.
Sorry, let me say something right this point. When I say they are risk averse, they are risk averse for themselves in their bureaucratic position. They're
Right.
not risk averse
Sure.
for society.
Sure, but what will happen if at some point people bring a class action suit against the government?
I know.
The government is definitely going to turn around and look for people to blame. They're going to look for scapegoats. They're going to find the deputies. They're going to find the directors general. They're going to find the directors who were responsible for these decisions, and there will be hell to pay.
Yes.
Now, related. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's a very American. I'm not sure whether it would ever happen in Canada.
I think it's already happened in Canada.
Okay. Well,
yeah. I think it already has happened. I can't give you a chapter and verse. Not a lawyer, don't know the cases.
Okay.
Pretty sure it's happened in the UK as well over bovine spongiform encephalopathy.
Yes. Yeah.
I
Yes.
think it might have happened here over the same thing. But anyway, now this is the second part, second observation. The government professes and has signed international agreements that says that it will use the precautionary approach.
Oh, right.
Okay. So I would argue that they have said on paper that they will take the precautionary approach, but they're doing exactly the opposite. Because the precautionary approach would say, if we don't know, we should not do it.
Yeah.
This is a lot like a physician saying, first, do no harm. If I don't know that I'm going to kill the guy, I'm not going to do it. And that's what they should be doing and aren't.
This is heresy, but I'm afraid I gave up on the precautionary principle a long time ago, particularly after I found these viewpoints which have been put forward by Sir Austin Bradford Hill. These are a whole series, I think there are 9 of them, of different ways of looking and synthesizing, integrating the evidence to see as to whether you actually have a causal relationship. And I think the big problem for me has been that we have had enormous amounts of evidence of one kind or another, but the governments have no inclination to go and use these viewpoints to synthesize a case using the criminal law power to make decisions and to reject the uncertainty. And because they haven't done this, and because they haven't used the law to bring this together, and they have frankly been rather lazy in saying, well, let's use the precautionary principle. It's as though this was a shortcut, this was a heuristic, in a way that they don't have to do this extraordinarily difficult work, which is very taxing and very demanding. I would say that without that kind of forensic capability within government, the precautionary principle is simply a toss away. It's a way of not addressing the enormity of what is actually going on effectively.
So Tim Lash, if you would turn on your and go ahead, and Vic Buxton, you're going to be after Tim Lash and then Art Hunter.
Michael, thank you for so much for this and for your work. I don't know if everybody knows, but you have, I've seen you get a standing ovation from doctors for the creative and innovative way that you've doggedly pursued your ideas and the facts. So congratulations on that. I think everybody should know that. Secondly, I wonder, looking for action or ways through, I recognize the sort of the gloomy picture of the present that you're presenting about action. But I still am wondering what centers of awareness and investigation and political or policy motivation and response there are, nonetheless, A, in Canada and B, elsewhere. And one thing that I'm noticing is the advent of 2 things, that I think there's more of an appetite for complexity than I've seen before in my life in policy and other things. Taglines like metacrisis, which brings together various things. So that's one thing that makes me think there's more receptivity to the kind of complex synthesis that you've pointed out as being necessary to bring pressure to bear. Second thing I wonder about is, it seems to me, although I know not much about it at all, but artificial intelligence has the potential to be guided in its self-development according to its algorithms and the information it's exposed to. And so I wonder if in epidemiology and the kind of complex cases you've highlighted, whether AI has potential to be helpful in this.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions. I'm going to address point B before I address point A. I think at the international level, there is an enormous awareness, particularly in the United States. There are all sorts of social movements and parts of civil society that are mobilized around this. I mean, particularly starting with the late Dr. Theo Colborn and her TEDx organization. I would also say that in Europe as well, there has been an enormous interest in the whole area of endocrine disruptors, and particularly at the legislative level. I'm not sure how successful they've been in getting chemicals under control, but certainly there has been far more interest there than in Canada. It's been extremely difficult, I find, to find any competence within the bureaucracy and within the medical community as well. The medical community talks about different kinds of competencies that are needed for practice. Also, the Public Health Agency of Canada has just gone through a process of updating its competencies as well. But you go through both the 2008 and, as far as I can make out, the most recent inquiry into the competencies that are needed. And the whole issue of endocrine disruptors is completely absent. It's completely silent. Anything to do with chemicals is completely silent, which infers that the Public Health Agency of Canada simply does not have any competence of its own in this area. The other question, which really interesting question that you brought forward, is the whole area of artificial intelligence and complexity. At the moment, I'm working with Dr. Rena Bray in her, she has a clinic, an environmental health clinic in just north of Toronto. And she and I are putting together a curriculum, a new curriculum on environmental medicine. I think what she has found, is not particularly any secret, is that there has been a fair amount of hostility towards environmental health, environmental medicine amongst the medical community in Ontario, maybe in other areas as well. And I think, as you say, there is a growing awareness of the complexity of some of the conditions that people are presenting with. And we are putting together this new curriculum to try to start addressing these kinds of competencies which are needed to look at environmental health and environmental medicine, and to see whether, in fact, we can bring a better appreciation amongst the doctors of these kinds of epidemics that are going on at the moment, chemically induced epidemics, which have been occurring for a long period of time, but have been largely missed.
Thank you. Well, much life to that effort.
Yeah. Okay, Vic, it's your turn, and then it's going to be Art Hunter, and then Richard, you've had a number of different comments. You may just want to put them into everybody's focus.
Well, first, Michael, thank you for an excellent presentation. I enjoyed that very much. By way of background, I need to tell you that I joined Environment Canada when it was formed. 2 weeks after I joined, I was part of the Great Lakes negotiating agreement for the Great Lake Water Quality Agreement. You know, I was on the team that put together SEPA initially and the reasons for it and why and all of the field. But the comment I really want to 2 points I want to focus on. And this is the, you know, the uncertainty aspect and why bureaucrats can't take action. And if they do take action below the ministerial level, they can be hung out to dry.
Sure.
For example, I was involved personally with the regulation of PCBs, regulation of CFCs, numerous other chemicals. Okay, and one incident when we could give you as a classic example that's really affected my life. When we were regulating chlorofluorocarbons after the Montreal Protocol, you know, I got a call from somebody that was thinking of buying, you know, a business opportunity, and the question was, you know, you're regulating CFCs, but will you regulate halons? Now, halons were 32 times more destructive. And I said, yes, but the volume of them is small, so they'll be next in line. Then I was asked to appear on Marketplace television show.
Yeah.
Okay, and they gave the guy that was selling these franchises the Entrepreneur of the Year award. And then they introduced me as a bureaucrat that was screwing up. He would have even done better if not for guys like me working for government.
Sure.
Okay, and this is interesting. So basically, after that, and I come back home, the next thing I get is a lawsuit against me.
Oh,
Me and the minister, McMillan, Tom McMillan, and others. Okay, and that was multi-million dollars.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the next thing I hear, well, there's been a change to that from the Department of Justice. McMillan's off. It's just me. And you know something, I was, till a year before I retired, I was in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and Department of Justice couldn't decide whether they were going to come to my defense. The issue was, has this bureaucrat exceeded his authority by speaking up and telling this guy that it's next in line? You know, and so what I caution about is it's the senior elements that really hamstring the guys with the knowledge base at the, you know, the ground level, the scientists or something else. And that was especially relevant when Harper got in. You know, everything then had to go through the PMO. You're not allowed as an expert to be a spokesperson on part of Canada, where the scientists years before were. You know, and so you look at this thing, and even the GMO issue, I chaired a meeting at Harvard University on GMOs, and there was a big conflict at that time between France and other countries. And France was worried that GMOs was going to destroy the farming industry in France. And, you know, the argument was, you know, that you're exercising the precautionary principle on one hand. And the counter argument was, no, you're using the strategic application of doubt. So it become quite interesting, this fight. So the issue is, if we're going to change the system, it's got to be from the top down, not from the bottom up. You know, and I was always worried about GMOs from the point of view that if you know, if somebody wants to create a tree, you know, they do clearing exercise, everything out, and they replant a tree, and maybe it's one with GMOs, but no one knows what the impact is on the environment because we haven't the knowledge base yet to determine it. There's no withholding of the introduction of some of these processes until we really understand fully all of what's going on there. So I don't know what the response can be, but you know, it just worries me when I see this, and I have experienced it with lead and gasoline, all of these other issues that I was personally involved with. You know, it's got to start at the ministerial level down. Ministers have to be able to take aim and argument with industry, and I'd like your view on that approach. And sorry for taking so long.
Top down, bottom up. I suppose you and I, Vic, came out of the 1960s, and I was in Northern Ireland. I was in Belfast at the time, I went on civil rights marches down to City Hall to present petitions, that kind of thing. All sorts of stuff was happening right around the world in terms of an outraged generation. And the incredible thing about that social process was that we brought about very significant changes. Quite outside of government, we influenced government from the outside, and that was a bottom-up response. I agree, bottom-up in the bureaucracy is hopeless. It has to come from the top, but the top always says it can't really respond to situations until the people express their outrage at what is going on. So I'm afraid at this point, I really believe it's probably a process of taking to the streets, organizing and displaying the kind of outrage that is needed before the governments, both liberal and conservative, before they understand just the kind of responses they need to bring about. The formation of the Department of the Environment, the formation of the Environmental Protection Service, all those things, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, all those things really were a response to the outrage that was felt from youth during and expressed during the 1960s. I think we got to have it again.
Oh, thank you.
Art, it's your turn.
Yes, thank you for that excellent talk. I'm not from the sector, so but I can see so many parallels between endo-destructive chemicals, you know, PCBs, CFCs, mercury, and the whole concept of burning fossil fuels and destroying the atmosphere and causing climate change. You know, very disruptive and dangerous things to all species on the planet, including humans, of course. Of course, there are movements, social movements that are afoot. There are some people who have started driving electric vehicles well before them becoming mandatory. There's people who, for example, even with the smoking time, you know, stopped smoking as soon as the tobacco industry was defending it, but the scientists were taking swings at it. Which sort of leads me to the point of saying, are there certain foods that social movements can say to avoid? I'm not sure if maybe they're doing it already. I'm just not aware. And to help raise the pain within industry, and maybe they will start to consider being less aggressive.
I don't know a lot about food. I know a bit about contaminants in food, both commercial, but also in field foods as well, the foods taken from the environment. I can't really respond, I think, knowledgeably about that. One of the interesting things in looking at hypotheses of causation is from very early on in my time, even before I came to Canada, I'd been working on peregrine falcons and the decline in the population. And one of the interesting things was the process by which this friend of mine, Derek Ratcliffe, went and put out all the different possible causal agents as to why the peregrine population was declining and then systematically going through the process of showing empirically why each of those different agents was unlikely to be the causal factor, and then being left with the introduction of pesticides as the most likely causal agent, and then following that. One of the problems that I see today is that we put out all the possible causal agents, and we never go about the process of actually refuting any of them. We don't get rid of any of them. And that, I think, is what has happened, particularly in the obesity area. The number of possible causal factors in obesity is long. But not only did the most likely one get left off, but scientists, nutritionists don't go about the systematic process of refuting the ones which are unlikely to be causal. And I have a feeling that in a way we have corrupted our science, because a person's whole career can be wrapped up in a particular possible causal agent, and you would hate to go and refute their hypothesis on the off chance that they would have to give up that area and give up that particular funding source. Anyway, that's my skepticism and cynicism about what is happening at the moment.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering what is going to cause this mass movement of people marching the streets. You know, you're talking about trying to get the public to react in a way that the politicians will pay attention. And I listen to that, and I say I completely agree. But we're down to the point of saying, just how do you do that? How do you get people so concerned that they're ready and willing to go out and do protests and write their MPs and start exercising that influence?
Well, there's this really neat organization called the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome, and they invite people like myself to come and give talks and to try to persuade people out there that there is this evidence, that there is this story, and that they are part of the story, and to try to radicalize people that way.
Very good answer. We do what we can. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you for the humor. Richard, you had a number of different comments that I thought maybe you wanted to articulate. And then Meg Sears also wants to add something.
Well, I think one of the things that actually, and Michael, once again, thanks for this great talk. I think just from the discussion today, there's enough expertise already around the table in terms of people who could contribute to building a case for bringing this to the Supreme Court, and like that, and together with other groups like the Canadian Environmental Law Association, CELA for short, you could build a case, and then we could actually then, first of all, I would suggest you start with some editorial pieces or submitted opinion pieces, to the Globe and Mail or to the Hill Times or both. And then that educates people that this is an issue. And then secondly, then you move forward and we try and find some way of following this up legally. I think really, if we can get, basically the ways of if we can get the legal ways of moving forward, you build a strong case and you can talk to a lawyer or the CELA, for instance, and see, are they willing, given the evidence, to follow up on this? In fact, maybe one way is to send them the link to this talk and say, what do you think about taking this to the Supreme Court? It's a thought.
I don't know how to respond. Would this be a specific case where injury had occurred? Would you? I'm not quite sure how you would actually formulate this and how you would move it forward to the Supreme Court without perhaps taking it through the rest of the federal system first, federal legal system first. I don't know how that would work.
Well, the obesogens would be a really good example. You take the obesogens and the endocrine disrupting chemicals and how they continue to be passing through, and they're still not taken off the market and so forth. For years, we've been arguing that they should be taken off, and they still continue to be spread liberally all over the environment. Glyphosate is another good example, but all of that to say, if you could take obese people and take them as victims, and like it's such an epidemic, and there's a group that's been injured. They're developed diabetes, heart attack, and on, stroke. So the cardiovascular disease, and actually their increased tendency for some cancers, all of that to say, they are the injured group, and they're the perfect group to take forward. It's so common, as you have pointed out, that yeah, I think there is a case to be built that you could take that as the test group, if you will, and then say, but extend it out to other chemicals and say, this is just one example. There are many more.
That's really interesting. Perhaps you and I can talk further about this and see as to whether there is a way of actually making this happen.
Okay, so Meg, you're up. You can turn on your camera. And Mary, if you could turn off your video.
Yes, yes. Thanks again, Michael. I'll just comment briefly on the notion of some kind of class action in Canada. There's been class actions. Well, we looked at that with CELA, with Friends of the Earth, and with the lawyers from California regarding glyphosate. And so there has been a lot of thought about how to proceed in Canada, given our laws, in the same kinds of way that they've had really remarkable successes in California. And there are very large and very fundamental differences between the laws here and there. And in the end, I was involved in a discussion with the lawyers from the States and lawyers from Canada and so on. And I can't reproduce all of that, but we tried to, during the SEPA amendments, there was Bill S5 that has gone through the Senate, and it's been finalized now. We put forward a lot of recommendations to change the way that they do science, so that a lot of the kinds of things, the endocrine disruption and so on, would actually be considered as an endpoint that has to be considered during the assessment process. But the law actually prescribes what counts during these chemical assessments. And it is so limited that, the bureaucrats, in some ways, they feel as if their hands are tied. Their hands are somewhat tied, but then they're also not given the time and resources and so on to do proper reviews of the peer-reviewed science. They depend mostly upon the science that is given to them by the industry, and a lot of it's confidential test data and so on. So there's there's so many barriers. You know, the public is looking at the kind of documentation and very strong evidence that Michael is, and saying, we've got a really big problem. And then the bureaucrats are sitting there with their industry-sponsored studies and their blinders firmly affixed because of the restrictions in the laws. And it's as if, you know, there's two solitudes, and they look at completely different evidence and they come to opposite conclusions. And the laws are structured purposely to be so restrictive that it's going to be difficult in court. So there's a tremendous number of barriers in place, both in terms of how you do the science, what science gets considered, and so on. So this is an ongoing project. We've been in court regarding pesticides that were not properly assessed, that, you know, chlorpyrifos, it's very old organophosphate. They banned it in the States, and then Canada allowed 3 more years of it here. So guess where it all gets dumped, right? So anyway, that's kind of the legal end of it. But that actually wasn't what I was just pointing out. Right now, in the context of biodiversity, this is a new, well, it's not a new, people know that we've had problems with biodiversity for a really long time, but this is a new issue that is being dealt with by Minister Guilbeault. And I think he's probably going to have to get a hero's badge for some of the things he's been doing, because he really does try hard. I put a link in the chat to the biodiversity consultation document. And honestly, when I read that, this man, he needs some support. The prelude, the setup, you know, he basically says, we're in big trouble. We have to move quickly. Canada's made a commitment to reduce its pesticide use by 50% by the end of the decade. How the heck is that going to happen? And so there are openings, and there are kind of specifics that people can sort of hang their hats on, rather than saying, oh my goodness, we're all being poisoned by the chemical industries. There are opportunities, and that's something that we've been kind of working on. And this is one of them, to kind of put specifics in place that could kind of move the agenda. It's not going to be the be all and the end all, but it's, you know, certainly the problems with endocrine disruptors and so on have not been fixed in the latest iteration of SEPA. In fact, there was, you know, I spoke to the Senate, and then bang, everything was just completely turned on its head by the pesticide industry. And in the parliamentary hearing, CropLife, which only deals with pesticides, which are under a different law, CropLife was invited to present to the parliamentary committee. And all they talked about was how, you know, you don't want to use any of this modern toxicology. You have to stick with the tried and true old, you know, let's, you know, see no evil methodologies. So there's problems with industry capture, as well as scientific problems and legal problems.
So Michael, rather than commenting on Meg's extensive comment, we're at the point where we have to quit the recording, but there is an opportunity after that to have a free-for-all, and you can comment there. So Ted, could you do the thank you?
Oh, most gratefully, Michael, that was fabulous. I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't ever think of before. For I was, like many of the other people here, an inmate of a federal institution for a while. And we spent a lot of time briefing ministers and deputy ministers and other officials. And I share the frustration that I've heard today. the number of times I had to explain to someone what the words precautionary principle meant when they were using them and had no clue. And the number of times that we had to explain to them what they were mandated to do. And quite frankly, we have a lot of good scientists, a lot of policy analysts, and above them an awful lot of people who, I guess, clueless would be the nicest thing I could say. That said, it's very nice to see our cadre of capable people getting together and essentially talking about how we might fix it. This, by the way, isn't the first meeting I've had today on this from a totally different perspective, but the very same frustrations of why very good information cannot pry the system to do what is really necessary. So I would definitely thank you again and say we are continuing this series. We're getting towards 200 where we'll have a celebration. Next week, there is a fellow by the name of, let me see, it's Eric Milt, is it? Who's on the idea of footprints, and I don't know many more details of that. Perhaps Phil could fill us in on exactly what he may be talking about next week. But I would thank you again for all coming. Tell you that we are capturing this presentation. It will be coming out on our YouTube channel very shortly. Also, we would ask if you do this, please subscribe because it enhances our credibility with YouTube and other people who may want to come and see our very good presentations. I would also say if you are not a pub member, please join us. I was just reminded by our secretary that I had failed to pay my dues this month, and they are due in the first quarter of 2024. So thank you all again for coming. It's been another very interesting and hopefully stimulating initiative. And we will now let you go. You can turn on I'll stop the recording and you can turn on your video and your microphone, and you can talk some more on the same things if you find other questions you may have. And